Welcome once again to our show, and thank you for watching, as you are a viewing audience that makes this the #1 show on Cable Access Network. I want to thank everyone who makes this show possible, Pops and Tony and Bill Godomsky, our whole crew here at CAN TV, and all the staff here at CAN TV. I also want to thank you, our viewing audience, for watching, again, because you're so important, and don't turn that dial, because we have a fascinating show today with Chris Fogarty, no stranger to our show. He's been on before with his wife, Mary Fogarty. They are part of a group called Friends for Irish Freedom, and they have been advocating historical knowledge and also some kind of justice in terms of a recognition of the Irish genocide that happened in the mid-1800s.
Yes.
By the British government to the Irish people.
Correct. I'd like to thank you as we approach now St. Patrick's Day in 2014. I'd like to thank the Avila family for their generosity in providing us time here. We really appreciate it, and everyone Irish ought to appreciate what the Avila family is doing here in order to learn their own history, to learn the history of our people.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And my family has been involved with the Irish American Heritage Center. My mother sings in Irish choir, and I have a little bit of Irish blood. So I think it's important to recognize this. But even if you're not Irish, even if you're whatever, it doesn't matter what race, I think that the common part of recognizing the Irish, the genocide against the Irish people, is our common humanity.
Exactly.
And being human beings, and being people who believe in justice. So to me, it's a human thing and not just an Irish thing. Certainly people of Irish heritage should learn about their history and the grievances against them. But I think that it is a human thing. It is the whole planet. And I think that it's important to learn about these genocides so they never happen again.
That's the whole point. We must preclude genocide as government policy. The government policy of genocide must end. It has not ended. They're going on today. And we must denounce them, we must attack them, we must end genocide as government policy.
And you've seen some things in the media, and recently we were just discussing it before the show, which has become a little bit more to light, I'd say, in the last 10, 20 years. The Armenian genocide that some Turks, the Turkish government,
Yes.
and some of the other peoples in the Middle East took upon the Armenian peoples who were killed. Of course, the Shoah, the Holocaust of the Jewish
Yes.
people in World War II.
Yes.
And the Ukrainian peoples, Stalin had the Holodomor,
Yes.
very similar to this, a forced starvation.
Indeed.
Against the...
And during World War II, in Bangladesh and part of India, where some 4 to 5 million people were starved to death in a country with plenty of food, when the British Army removed it at gunpoint. I had a conversation a year ago with the author of a book she's from Bangladesh, and is very well researched, does a fine job. I cannot think of her name now. It's a pity I shouldn't have mentioned it, but she has documented it all. It's just one more genocide. And Churchill was a responsible party.
And even more recently, you've had Africa and Rwanda.
Indeed,
and
yes.
some of the other goings on,
Yes.
some issues in Bosnia.
Yes.
And the Belgian government also had some horrible actions in the Congo and 100 years ago or so.
Yes.
So we have to recognize these genocides, these horrible things in history, not just to revisit or make bloody wounds or not to move on from it, because we are moving on from it, but to move forward with justice and move forward to not make sure this kind of stuff doesn't happen again.
With full knowledge of the past.
Right. Because even after 1850, the British were very oppressive to the Irish people.
Sure. In fact, there was across the river from where my mother was born, in North County Galway, there was a place that she used to lower her voice sort of emotionally in saying Connolly's Gardenines. It was a place across the river in the bog where local people, when evicted from their good land up the hill, would try to survive there in virgin bog. And it was touch and go. Some survived, some did not. And that was in the 1870s and 1880s. So it didn't end. It only ended, starvation in Ireland ended only when the English landlords were bought out and repatriated to England. It ended then and not until then. That repatriation.
And for a long time, until relative recent history, Irish Catholics could not buy property. They couldn't be property owners.
Right, they couldn't be property owners. They couldn't educate their children. It was a felony crime under British rule in Ireland to educate your children, or to become a school teacher, or to own a horse more than 5 pounds, or to own any land. 5 families, in fact, the entire Irish nation was the enemy, killable at will, except for 5 Irish families. And they were humans. Everyone else had been stripped of their legal personhood. And not lacking legal personhood, it did not involve the law if somebody killed you. It wasn't murder because you had to be legally human to be murderable.
Another thing I think people don't realize about the Irish is that, and not just the Irish, of course, and of course the greatest slavery ever done was the transatlantic African slave, which was horrible. And of course, you know, we had a civil war over it, and so many millions of people died on the transatlantic slave ships, and the horrible treatment that many of them had by slave owners, and the slave trade, which is a horrible, inhumane, this horrible, dehumanizing, inhuman, horrible trade. But there were also Irish slaves that ended up in the Caribbean, in sugar plantations, indentured servants that ended up in the Americas.
Yes.
And in fact, Oliver Cromwell, sold 30,000 Irishmen in one day into slavery.
Yes, that would be after 1650, I would think. He, those he didn't kill, he rounded up and sold into slavery in the Caribbean, to English planters in the Caribbean. Right. To this day, in the island of Montserrat, the government house has a shamrock on the gable. That occurred after the English lost their property there. But there are many Irish place names there. There's a Fogarty Hill there. Right. So some of my ancestors must have been enslaved, and then later, while still retaining the name, were able to give give place names their names. But no one down there looks like me today.
They interbred with the
the incoming slaves. Right. Yes, and so it's a mixed group today. But there's a touch of the brogue there to this day, right, in Montserrat.
And it was very brutal for them because it was a very different climate. She took people from a northern climate into a Caribbean climate,
yes,
where it's very hot, very humid.
Yes.
You know, a lot of sunburn, a lot of,
indeed,
you know.
They must have died fairly young or frequently of skin cancer because I got it myself, having lived in the tropics for a while, and they were known as red shanks. Shank is the word for leg. Right. So red shanks, you see, would be sunburned people.
Right.
So that would indicate that they were not apt in that climate.
And you see a lot of African Americans, black people, who have Irish names, Collins, and so you see that there was that Irish influence and the intermixture with slaves, especially in the Caribbean.
I must say, most of the people who took Anglo names, or names in English, not African, they took the names of their slave owners. Right. So what you're just saying there is that there might have been some Irish slave owners, and we would not want to condone that idea.
Right.
Though it must be true. It must be partly true. But essentially, all the slave owners in the American South were English and Scottish, mostly English.
Right.
But also
and
Scottish.
Some Scottish names are the same as Irish names.
Indeed, they are. Yes.
Right. Maybe with a different spelling or something like that.
Yes, slightly different. Yes. Scotland was largely Teutonic or Germanic until the Irish invaded it around the time of Christ.
Right.
And they took most of the Highlands. In fact, wherever Gaelic is spoken in Scotland today is where they went.
Right.
And they cannot. The languages remained similar enough that they understand each other. So Scottish Gaelic and Irish Gaelic are mutually understandable.
Right. And the Highlanders and some of the islands have the most common culture to the Irish.
Yes.
Less so maybe the urban dwellers of Scotland.
Yes.
But the Highlander culture is somewhat, some people identify as Irish culture, bagpipes, kilts, and things like that.
Yes, yes. You know. Once I was working in Argentina and went down to the Malvinas, the Falkland Islands, and there was a man playing for set dancing for the islanders there. And I recognized, or almost recognized, many of the tunes. I was a musician myself of Irish traditional music, and at the time I could name maybe 400 or 500 different tunes by listening to them. And I was dying for him to take a pause because I wanted to talk about it. Where did he learn this music? I consider pure Irish music. And so when he did stop, he said he was born, lived there his whole life in Port Stanley, but that when he was 13 or 14 years of age, he went aboard the whaling vessels around the South Pole, and he picked up this music from Norwegian sailors.
Interesting.
And so all I can think of is that there might have been a northwestern European music at one time that exists almost exclusively in Ireland today.
Right.
And otherwise, I'm baffled. I just don't understand it. Why he would have learned that music from Norwegian sailors.
Well, the Vikings, when they tried to conquer Ireland, they did intermarry.
Oh,
and
sure.
you see Irish blood and
Sure.
or Viking blood,
Sure.
and even Viking names that became assimilated in Irish culture, became
Indeed.
Catholic,
Yes.
spoke Gaelic.
Yes, MacAuliffe, for example, is son of Olaf,
Yeah.
or Olaf, see? And this-
McCaskill.
yes, also.
Berg.
Yes. Yeah, I must say the Bergs and the Burkes came later via the Normans. You see,
Right.
the Vikings went down, took a peninsula off France, which we now call Normandy, and then from there, 300 years later, jumped over, took England, and then 100 years later, sprang over from England and took Ireland.
Right.
So that was funny how, but the same Viking people were present in all cases.
You know, before we talk more specifically about the Holocaust of the Irish genocide, perhaps a Holocaust is more specific to the Jewish people, but the genocide of the Irish people, I think because we are so close to St. Patrick's Day, we should notice that even a lot of the Anglo-Irish poets and writers were Irish. They weren't just Anglo-Irish. They may have been British citizens before there was an Irish national identity. But Joyce, Oscar Wilde, many of the greats of
Yes.
that are considered the greats of Britain were actually Irish.
Indeed, yes, yes. Mixed. In fact, one of the great actors, O'Toole, maybe it was.
Peter O'Toole.
Peter O'Toole said that when he went out one night, and he had won a prize for acting.
Yeah.
The English newspaper carried British actor wins Oscar or something, and they went out and got into a big brawl that night. And the next day in the English newspaper was Irish actor in brawl.
Well, Peter O'Toole just died recently. Great actor. Masada,
Yes.
and he was in this recently in
Lawrence of Arabia.
Lawrence of Arabia, but
Yeah.
just recently he was in For the Greater Glory, formerly called Christiana, but of course Lawrence of Arabia, Masada, just awesome movies. So let's talk a little bit specifically about what is called the genocide of the Irish, the period between 1845 and to 1850.
Yeah.
And you know, you told me one time, yeah, I think I even had mentioned while you're speaking of the famine, right? Everybody calls it the famine or the potato famine. That's
Yes.
what you hear in books
Yes,
or in history
yes,
or in
yes,
movies
yes.
or in common parlance. But in fact, it was not a famine.
Specifically not a famine. A famine is an absence of food. But all of these British regiments, each little Union Jack here is a British regiment. Each regiment is about 1,000 troops, 5 companies of 200 each. And you can look at this map and see which British regiment starved which part of Ireland. This number of regiments were over half of the British Empire Army at the time. And so it took over half the British Empire Army to create what we were taught in school was a potato famine. And so one crop failed, but they failed everywhere. They failed universally, even in the United States at that time. In fact, it hit the United States before it hit Europe. So the potato blight was everywhere, phytophthora infestans. But so they sent over their army. Many had been here already because the Irish were not willing participants. They were not willingly occupied by the English in all those years. There was a series of attempts to wipe them out. I happen to use the word holocaust only because with all due respect to the Shoah victims and the Jewish effort to call the Shoah Holocaust today, what I don't like, however, is that I don't like them claiming any kind of a patent on the word. The reason I use it is because of historical precedents. It was used in the Cork Examiner newspaper in 1847. It was described as Holocaust, and was described as such by Michael Davitt in his writing in his books of the time. So,
So perhaps the term the Shoah would be exclusive to Jewish people.
Yes.
But the Holocaust could be used and has been used apparently with other
Indeed.
groups.
Well, the reason why it was adopted for Ireland is that it was so grotesque that the people reached to the Bible for a word that might describe the horror. And so the word Holocaust came from the Bible. It happens to be etymologically apt for Ireland also, because in thousands of houses, and all of Ireland at the time, the houses were thatch roofed. And so when an entire family would be found dead by their neighbors in one of their houses, in a house, in many cases, instead of burying the occupants, they would torch the thatch and cremate the people inside. And so, and Holocaust, cost is to burn, and holo is entirely. And so they were entirely burned, cremated. And so it's as I say, etymologically apt also to use Holocaust for Ireland. But above all, it has historical precedence. It was used all that time, not by the Big Lie operatives. The Big Lie operatives have imposed famine upon all school children. But it was certainly not a famine. But I would just like to point out for people from the various counties, for the Mayo people, they were starved by the 7th Hussars, the 19th Hussars. Hussar was a lightly armed cavalryman. The 69th of foot, that's of infantry, the 30th Regiment of Infantry, the 5th Dragoons. The Dragoons were mounted also, and they were more heavily armed. The 49th of foot, the 41st, the 63rd in Galway, and further down the 40th in Galway. And I must say, I'm embarrassed to mention it, but the truth is the truth. My grandfather, who barely survived these years, he was 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 years of age during those years. When he turned 18, he walked from his town it doesn't show on the map, not large enough. He walked to Avila, and he joined this regiment, the 40th Regiment of Foot, and he served for nearly 30 years in the 40th Regiment, the very regiment that starved South County Galway when he was a boy. That goes to show when the nation is defeated, they will join the army of their occupiers, because oftentimes, in fact, in most cases, an occupied country, there are no jobs available. The entire commerce is taken over by the occupiers, and you can be a servant or a policeman carrying guns, or a jailer or a soldier, but in a great many cases, the local men are carrying guns to be used against their own people if they're willing to do it. And so here's in County Clare, the 73rd Regiment of Foot starved County Clare, the 41st. And I must say, if you count these up, all of these, there are 75, but I made a couple of double counts. This 41st, I show both sides of Galway because I couldn't superimpose it. And then I later, so there were actually 68 total regiments, not 75, but 68 regiments total that starved Ireland. And they starved Ireland only after the local landlords' militias, and there were about 50,000 landlords' troops in Ireland, and there were some 12,900 constables in Ireland. And only when the constables ran into trouble getting the food to the ports, they were joined by the militia, and when both the forces together were having trouble from the people who were trying to hold on to their food, only then was the British Army regiment sent in. So you can see where the regiments are located, where they had most trouble from the people. In areas here where there were no British regiments, and yet there are plenty of little crosses. Each cross is a mass grave, and that's only a small number of the total. But there's a mass grave, and every single one of those where you see a cross is a mass grave. The reason is that for no army there is that the constables and the militia alone, combined with the local English population, they were able to get the food away from the people. And it turns out that of all the people who died, essentially 100% were Catholic. But up here, there were so many Protestants that they were, and English and Protestant is essentially synonymous. They essentially the same thing. If they were English, they were Protestant. If they were Irish, they were Catholic. That's generally how it worked at the time.
Although there were some Irish Protestants that were very integral to the Irish independence movement.
Indeed, they led.
William Butler Yeats was Protestant, I believe.
He was Protestant, but I must say his poetry is very ambiguous. he expressed an awful lot of doubt about the rising of 1916. And one of his poems asks whether something he wrote might have sent young men out to die.
Right.
So he was of the landlord class, so he was considered a traitor to his class by even being ambiguous about it. But there were true patriots. In 1798, there was
and Trinity College had a strong, they educated quite a few of the people who became leaders in independence.
They did indeed. One of them was Robert Emmet, who at 25 years of age, when he was sentenced to be hanged and beheaded by British Lord Norbury in Dublin, and I was in that self-same courtroom when there was a framing of another Irishman in 2003, in the self-same courtroom. The difference between 1803 and 2003 is that Robert Emmet, in his fantastic speech written when he was 25 years of age, a day or two before he was hanged and beheaded, he complained that the jury were selected in order to convict, that the sentence was known at the time the jury was impaneled. In the case of the man who was framed in the same courtroom in Dublin in 2003, he didn't get a jury at all. There was no jury, and so he was sent away for 27 years. So that's the progress that goes on there, if you can call it progress. But so my grandfather went out and he did to the Maoris what the same army had done to his own people, and he went to India, and he was in Bombay for the celebrations of Queen Victoria becoming the Empress of India. He later retired at 13 shillings and sixpence 4 times a year, and in not far from Mount Rath, just outside of Mount Rath here. And then he came to Chicago. My father came to Chicago, and my uncle came to Chicago and joined the British Army when the Americans were not in World War I yet, and died in the Canadian Army in World War I. But here we have the warship Stromboli was over here to guard the merchant vessels leaving Ireland.
With food, they were leaving with food, the merchant vessels.
Indeed. In fact, an American captain of bringing in relief grains, corn from America, pointed out that he was met by 6 ships sailing out of Ireland with food. As he entered with 1 ship carrying food to Ireland, that he met 6 ships leaving with food. So that's what the situation was. But for some reason, the schools to this day do not want this truth told. And the schools in Chicago do not want this told. It's 15 years ago, since sitting right here, I debated 4 Chicago history professors, and they could not stand. This enraged them. They couldn't say it was false. It's not false because all of this information comes from the British Public Record Office. Now it's called the British Archives in Kew outside London. It's from the records, the national records of the British military forces. You can't argue with it. And so there it is. There's a story of a genocide. My preference is Holocaust for the reasons stated that it was used at the time. But other words that one could use would be extermination. I think is less apt because it suggests a total wipeout, nobody left, or genocide, which is the most apt today, but it did not exist at the time. Genocide was coined by Raphael Lemkin in 1945 to describe what the Nazis were doing. And so I'm a little bit reluctant to use a name that never was used at the time. Holocaust was used at the time.
And they had already killed people, too. I think it's important to note it wasn't just people starving, that there were people dying who were killed by the British troops.
Yes, there was no penalty. As I mentioned, the Irish people had been stripped of legal personhood. And if you were not a legal person, your killing was a non-event. It did not involve the law. Very sad to say. So we're getting this out. I thought that this map, and it was in pamphlet form first, and now it's on the internet. I thought it was going to bring the big lie to an end. It has forced the big lie operatives, the so-called famine writers, to abandon some 90% of their falsehoods. But they've changed it. They used to say no food left Ireland. That is false. They used to say no food left Ireland when the people starved. Now they're admitting that, for example, 4,000 shiploads of grain alone sailed into Liverpool alone in 1847 alone. So they've abandoned that falsehood. But now they're saying that it was the rich Irish starving the poor Irish. Now that's a very interesting one. But that would raise the next question: why was the British Army in Ireland to help the rich Irish? See, it doesn't make any sense.
And there weren't a lot of rich Irish because most of the landowners were the English landlords.
Essentially 100%.
And they were giving land since Henry VIII and Elizabeth for their loyal nobles.
They had it all. They had all of it. In fact, the very family, the sixth Lord Ashbrook, that evicted my great-grandparent from their lands in Ballykeely, Durrow, County Laois, down here, not far from Mountrath. He now is living in his 1,000-acre estates in Cheshire, in England. They had it at that time. They bought that land in England from what they squeezed out of the people of Ireland.
Now, you wrote a book.
Yes.
What's the name of the book?
The book is let me think for a second. Ireland, 1845, 1850, The Perfect Holocaust, and Who Kept It Perfect. Perfect in quotation marks, in the sense of the perfect crime.
So you wrote a book on the Irish Holocaust.
Yes.
I would encourage all my viewers to check it out. And you have a website too. What's the name of the website?
irishholocaust.org.
irishholocaust.org, and your organization is Friends for Irish Freedom.
Friends of Irish Freedom.
So check out Friends for Irish Freedom and the website,
www.irishholocaust.org.
irishholocaust.org. Learn about it. If you want to come, if you disagree, you want to debate, Chris Fogarty is always open to that. Him and his wife have been on our show before. Check out the other programs on YouTube. They're still on the air, and actually we're going to bring Chris on again because he has some other interesting stories to tell about our own FBI and setups and a lot of interesting stuff that's all real, not fiction. Chris, thank you for being on our show.
Thank you very much, and thank your whole family for supporting the Irish in this way.
Thank you. Goodbye, and God bless.